Imagine standing in the middle of a capital city on a Friday night, and instead of, neon signs and streetlights, you are in absolute suffocating darkness.
Not just a flicker. We're talking about a complete blackout.
We are talking about Havana, Cuba, and this was just yesterday, February 6th, 2026. The reports we have from the Havana Times paint this picture that's, well, it's less like a modern city and more like a ghost town.
It's eerie. Empty bus stops, shuttered windows.
And a silence that only happens when the machinery of a city literally just grinds to a halt.
Exactly. And what we're seeing isn't just a power outage. It's really the systemic collapse of a country's ability to even function.
That is precisely what we're unpacking today. The mission for this deep dive is to understand how a nation of 11 million people went dark for nearly 15 hours in a single day.
Right.
And we aren't just looking at old power plants breaking down. This is a story about a captured president in Venezuela, a brand new executive order from the White House, Turkish ghost ships.
And a desperate pivot to, 19th century farming methods. It's a true convergence of factors. We've got a sack of sources today on the ground reporting from 14 Medio, legal analysis from Mayor Brown on the U.S. sanctions.
Well, let's get into the reality on the ground first, because numbers from yesterday are just staggering. You look at the official data, they don't call it a catastrophe, they call it a deficit.
The terminology is interesting, but let's just look at the math. The peak demand, what the country needed to keep everything running, was about 3,100 megawatts.
And what were they actually generating?
1,394 megawatts.
Wow. That's less than half. That's a 1,760 megawatt hole in the grid.
To put that in perspective for you, imagine trying to power a modern 4-bedroom house with the air conditioning on, the fridge running, all of it, using a single AA battery.
Okay, that's a powerful analogy.
That's the scale of the energy poverty we're talking about. When you miss the mark by nearly 60%, you aren't doing rolling blackouts anymore. You are effectively disconnecting the country.
And that disconnection, it just bleeds into everything. I was reading a report from 14 Medio about transportation, and it sounds dystopian. It's not just that the lights are out. People literally cannot move.
Because there's no fuel. The public buses, they say, have practically disappeared from the streets.
And the report mentioned a trip across Havana, something that used to be a cheap, routine commute. Now it requires a private taxi, and the price for that...
It's exploded. We're seeing fares of 550 pesos for a single trip.
Which is absolutely crushing. For a lot of Cubans, 550 pesos is more than their entire budget for an outing, maybe a huge chunk of their monthly pension.
So if you can't afford the taxi, and the bus never comes, you're trapped. You can't get to work, can't get to the doctor, you're just frozen in place.
And even if you have your own car, it's not like you can just pull up to a gas station. I was digging into this ticket app they've launched. It feels like a digital rationing card.
It is exactly that. When you can't guarantee supply, you have to throttle demand. So the government forces you to register on this app, Ticket, just to get a spot in line.
And the limit is what, 20 liters? That's it.
20 liters. And remember, you need a charged phone to use the app.
Yeah.
And internet connectivity. Both of which are failing because there's no electricity.
It's a catch-22. You need power to get the fuel, and you need fuel to get the power.
It's a death spiral. And the government's response has been this extreme austerity. We're seeing a mandated 4-day work week for state employees.
And schools are going hybrid, which, let's be honest, is just code for stay home because the classrooms are dark and there's no air conditioning.
It saves energy, sure, but it completely halts the economy. You can't run a country on a 4-day week.
Okay, so let's pivot to the why. Because for a long time, the narrative was just that Cuba's power plants were old. And they are. But there was this stopgap solution, right? I remember a couple of years ago, they made a huge deal about these Turkish power ships.
The floating barges.
From Karadeniz Holding. They were docked in the harbor, plugging right into the grid. It seemed like a pretty smart, quick fix. But I saw a report that the biggest one, the Suhaila Sultan, just packed up and left.
That was a massive blow. The Suhaila Sultan was providing 240 megawatts of baseload power. It left Havana recently, and the official reason was commercial reasons.
Which is code for Cuba didn't pay the bill.
Precisely. It's a cash flow crisis. You can lease a power plant, but if you stop paying the rent, the landlord takes it back. There's a smaller ship there now, the Cancun Bay, but it's a fraction of the capacity.
And you still need the fuel to run it.
You still need the fuel, which brings us to the crude oil problem. And this is where the technical side gets really nasty. With no money to buy clean diesel, what are they burning in these old Soviet-era plants?
What were they burning?
They are burning native Cuban crude. And this is something people often overlook. Cuban crude is incredibly heavy. It has a very, very high sulfur content.
So it's sludge, basically.
It is corrosive sludge. When you burn high sulfur oil in a plant designed for lighter fuel, it literally eats the machinery from the inside out. It corrodes the boilers, clogs the injectors.
They fix a plant, bring it online, and a few weeks later it crashes again because the fuel destroyed it.
That's the cycle. They're destroying their own infrastructure just to keep the lights on for a few hours.
Because they have no other choice.
No choice. It's that or total darkness.
But this lack of fuel, the reason they're burning sludge in the first place, this didn't just happen by accident. This connects directly to that geopolitical earthquake we saw in January. We have to talk about Venezuela.
This is the external shock that tipped the whole thing over. For 2 decades, Venezuela was the lifeline. They sent oil, heavily subsidized, often on credit. It was the only reason the lights stayed on this long.
And then came the U.S. operation in January 2026.
The capture of Nicolás Maduro. That event didn't just remove a leader, it decapitated the alliance. The U.S. seized the financial structures. We know about $500 million intended for Venezuelan oil sales was seized and then redirected.
So overnight, Cuba lost its supplier and the money it was using to facilitate the trade.
Effectively, yes. The tankers just stopped moving.
Yeah.
And normally, in a situation like this, a country would just find another seller. You'd go in the open market.
Yeah. But the U.S. government anticipated that. And this is where that new executive order from the Trump administration comes in. I was reading the legal analysis from Mayor Brown, and the language in it is incredibly aggressive.
It is the definition of maximum pressure. On January 29th, the White House declared a national emergency regarding Cuba. Now, that sounds like rhetoric, but legally, it unlocks something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Which allows them to do what exactly?
It allows them to weaponize the U.S. financial system against third parties. So the order authorizes tariffs and sanctions, not just on Cuba, but on any country or company that helps them.
This is what they call secondary sanctions.
Exactly. If you are a Mexican oil company, or maybe a Chinese shipping firm, the U.S. is basically saying, if you send a tanker to Havana, we will slap tariffs on all your goods or cut you off completely from the U.S. banking system.
That is a terrifying threat for any global company. You can't risk losing the entire American market just to sell a few barrels of diesel to Cuba.
And that's why the harbor is empty. It's a blockade enforced not by warships, but by the fear of losing access to the dollar.
This puts Mexico in just a brutal position. President Claudia Sheinbaum was positioning Mexico as a key ally, right? Stepping in when Venezuela faltered. But I saw reports that Mexico hit the brakes on oil shipments in mid-January.
Sheinbaum is caught in a trap. Mexico is Cuba's largest remaining supplier, but Mexico's entire economy is dependent on trade with the U.S. They cannot afford tariffs. It's that simple.
So what's their play? Are they just abandoning Cuba?
They're trying to thread an impossible needle. Diplomatic sources say Mexican officials are frantically negotiating with the U.S., trying to find a humanitarian exception.
Oh, okay.
They're arguing that if they don't send at least some oil, Cuba will suffer a total humanitarian collapse. Hospitals failing, water systems stopping. They're trying to frame it as aid, not trade.
But the U.S. administration seems reluctant to grant any loopholes.
Very reluctant. They see this energy crisis as the lever,
Yeah.
the one thing that might finally force political change.
Meanwhile, you've got Russia taking a very different tone. The Russian ambassador, Viktor Kornelli, was quoted saying, "Supplies will continue." It sounded very defiant.
Russia is playing a different game entirely. For them, this isn't about economics. It's pure geopolitics. They view Cuba as a strategic beachhead. Keeping the Cuban government afloat is just a way to poke the U.S. in the eye.
But can they actually do it? I mean, Russia's a long way away.
And that's the problem. Logistics. Sending a tanker from Veracruz, Mexico takes a couple of days. Sending one from St. Petersburg takes weeks. And Russia has its own war economy to manage. They can promise oil, but can they deliver enough, fast enough, to stop the grid from crashing again?
The UN doesn't seem to think so. I saw the UN resident coordinator, Francisco Pichon, is using terms like humanitarian collapse.
And we need to be very clear about what that actually looks like. When the grid fails for 15 or 20 hours a day, water pumps don't work. You can't flush toilets in high-rise apartment blocks. Food spoils.
Right, no refrigeration.
Hospitals rely on backup generators, but those generators need diesel, which is also running out. It's a cascade of failure.
So how is the Cuban government responding to this? They're completely backed into a corner. Are they admitting the system is broken?
Publicly? Absolutely not. President Diaz-Canel, Prime Minister Moreno Cruz, They're sticking to the script. They blame the financial and energy persecution by the U.S.
Which, to be fair, is a real thing. The sanctions are very real.
They are.
Yeah.
But the internal reaction, this is where it gets both fascinating and, frankly, tragic. They are pivoting to what they're calling a war economy.
I saw the details in their new agriculture plan. This just stopped me in my tracks. They announced a plan to plant 200,000 hectares of rice. Sounds like good news, right?
It does, until you read the fine print.
That's true.
They explicitly stated that because there is no diesel for tractors, this planting will be done using animal power.
You mean oxen and horses?
Oxen and horses. In the year 2026, just think about that image. On one hand, the regime is using sophisticated Chinese surveillance tech to monitor the internet and track dissidents.
So high-tech control.
And on the other hand, they are literally forcing farmers to yoke up oxen because they can't run a tractor. It's a collision of the 21st century police state and 19th century subsistence farming.
It's an admission that they can't maintain an industrialized society anymore.
It is. They are betting that the population can survive at a pre-industrial level, but the population isn't accepting it quietly.
We've seen the reports of protests, Santiago de Cuba, parts of Havana, people banging pots and pans.
The cacerolazos. That's the sound of hunger. And the chant, they're not about ideology anymore. They're shouting, corriente y comida, power and food.
And the government responds how? By cutting the internet.
That's standard operating procedure. Kill communication so the protests can't spread. Deploy the black berets, the special forces, to the streets. Diaz-Canel has threatened rigorous processing for anyone who protests.
So we have a standoff. The U.S. is betting that total collapse forces regime change. The regime is betting they can repress the population and survive on ox power until Russia or Mexico saves them.
And in the middle of all of it, the grid just keeps dying. I do want to touch on renewables for a second, because the government talks a lot about their new solar parks.
Right, the 49 new solar parks. That has to help, right?
You'd think so, but look at the math again. At peak sunlight, all those parks provide about 393 megawatts. The deficit, as we said, is 1,760. And solar has a fatal flaw in this specific crisis.
It doesn't work at night.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't provide baseload power. You need that steady, heavy power to keep the grid stabilized, 247. Solar panels without massive battery storage, which they don't have, cannot fix a baseload crisis. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound.
So, barring some massive geopolitical shift, the lights aren't coming back on anytime soon.
The infrastructure is too degraded, and the fuel is too scarce. Even if a tanker from Mexico arrives tomorrow, what does that buy them? A week, maybe two? The cycle of collapse is just accelerating.
This brings us to a really difficult realization. We talk about these high-level concepts: sanctions, executive orders, geopolitics. But the reality is playing out in the dark living rooms and empty kitchens of Havana.
It is.
The U.S. strategy is relying on the suffering of the Cuban people to force a political break. The Cuban government strategy is relying on the endurance of the Cuban people to outlast the pressure.
Both sides are using the population as the shock absorber.
And the question is, how much more can that shock absorber take? You can only ask a modern population to live in the 19th century for so long before something fundamental just snaps.
And with the internet cut and the streets dark, we might not even know it has snapped until it's already over.
We are going to be watching the trade talks between Mexico and the U.S. very, very closely. Because right now, the decision on whether the lights turn on in Havana is probably being made in a conference room in Washington or Mexico City.
That's where the real power lies.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's a heavy topic, but it's one we absolutely have to understand. We'll see you next time.